Welcome back. My next guest says religion has been given a free ride for way too long. He describes it as lethally dangerous nonsense. His book describes the God of the Bible as petty and vindictive, racist, a genocidal bully, and a control freak. In fact, he says if you believe in God, you're deluded. Will you welcome, please, Richard Dawkins, and joining him, UCD philosopher Dr. Gerard Casey, who I can tell you completely disagrees. You're both very welcome to the programme. I wonder if I just ask our audience a question, first of all, if you'd raise your hands. How many of you believe in God? Okay, a forest of hands. So, Richard Dawkins, these people are deluded. Every single one of them.
Well, I fear that's right, yes. I would say it's rather like the phenomenon of the imaginary friend that children have and that comfort them and console them. But there's actually not the slightest shred of evidence that any kind of supernatural being exists. So I'm sorry to say, deluded, yes.
Deluded. How can so many people be wrong?
Well, there was a time when everybody believed that the world was flat. There was a time when everybody believed that the sun whizzed round the earth. People are very, very frequently deluded. And by the way, of course, there was a time when people believed in Zeus and Apollo, and in other parts of the world they believed in Thor and Wotan. People have believed in fairies and leprechauns. Everybody in this room, I would guess, knows what it's like not to believe in the God of some other religion. You know that if you happen to be born in the Middle East, you'll probably be Muslim, and people who are born in the Middle East believe equally fervently in their God. They can't both be right. There are so many different gods that people have believed in throughout history.
So what people believe is really an accident of geography?
Exactly right, yes.
It would be fair enough if you said, look, this is stuff and nonsense, believe it if you wish, and carry on, you're not doing anyone any harm, but you believe the contrary, that religious is actively harmful.
No, I mean, I do say carry on. I don't say that it's actively harmful in most cases. I think in the great majority of cases it's completely harmless, and one could say the same thing of astrology and belief in telepathy and belief in water divining, all these things for which there's no evidence. There is a minority of people for whom it actually is harmful, the extremists. And a good case can be made that the decent, moderate people, just about everybody in this room, are in a sense paving the way, making the world safe for the extremists. Because decent, moderate, sensible, middle-of-the-road religious people teach children that faith is a virtue. That means believing something without evidence. And there's a minority of people who will take that really, really seriously, and they'll say, my holy book tells me that I've got to go out and kill infidels, kill apostates, that I've got to go and make a suicide bomber of myself, I've got to go and fly planes into skyscrapers in New York. It's only a minority. But if it wasn't for faith being given a free ride, but if it wasn't for faith being touted as a virtue, just about everybody in our civilization is taught that faith, that means belief without evidence, is a good thing, it's a virtue. Indeed, the less evidence there is, the more virtuous you are in believing it.
You also claim that a lot of stuff has been made up as say in the case of the Roman Catholic Church, they made the stuff up as they went along, stuff that is not even in the Holy Scriptures. For example, the virgin birth.
The virgin birth is in the Scriptures, but it's a misprint, it's a mistake, it's a mistranslation from Isaiah that was translated into Matthew and believed by people. And so
what was the proper translation in your view?
Oh, young woman. A young woman shall conceive and bear a child. That was mistranslated from the Hebrew for young woman into the Greek for virgin. And the whole virgin birth story started from that one mistranslation. It's the most astonishing piece of constructive error.
Gerard Casey, listening to what Richard is saying, how do you rebut what he's saying? Because in order to rebut, you've got to prove that there is a God, and no one so far has really come up with the definitive proof that there is.
Well, the trouble, I mean, first of all, you know, this is a sort of thrilling read. in many ways, and as an ex-atheist, because I was an atheist for 13 years, I found many parts of it interesting, and I can agree and sympathize with much of what Richard is saying in many respects. So there are lunatics out there, and they often use their belief systems and so on and so forth. But to take those as somehow the norm is a bit like saying if you visited South Chicago or West Side New York and took that to be, the norm for the rest of the United States. It's not. Now, there are many religions. Okay, and there are many, many creeds, and that cannot be denied, and they cannot all be true. That's a logical point, okay, and you'd have to agree with that. It doesn't mean that not one of them is true, by the way, but it doesn't mean that they can't all be true. But the key question here, and Richard again is correct to put his finger on it, which is this question of evidence. Now, in many cases, we believe things because we have things are obviously evident, right? But even leaving aside God, for example, we believe things, say, about our friends on less than full evidence. I mean, their faithfulness and their friendliness towards us and their good intentions. And indeed, we would continue to believe, if they are really our friends, in the face of countervailing evidence. No, not completely, right? So what the sort of religious phenomenon, to the extent that it depends, and not, as it were, on evidence, isn't something completely unusual. But I want to turn to the question of God, because God is the key thing here, right? And the fundamental question is not something about this particular religion, or that one. It's about whether or not the universe as a whole requires some fundamental explanation that is in some way outside or beyond, beneath, or
this is the divine architect.
Well, I mean, now, you see, the question here, one of the problems I have with Richard's book is that while many parts of it are good, the third chapter, to me, frankly, is unscientific in the sense that it doesn't look at the data, it doesn't analyze it properly, and it doesn't really look at what other people have said. I mean, there's been an argument and a discussion going on for over 3,000 years, and not just among religious people. I mean, it was started by the philosophers. And the question is, really, the basic question, and Richard is very well aware of this because he deals with this to some extent in the book, is why is there something rather than nothing? Right? That's the key question. So you're either going to have to say,
but if there was nothing, we wouldn't be talking about it, because we wouldn't be here.
We wouldn't have the question, right? So there is something, but that doesn't answer the question. The question is, why is there something rather than nothing?
Okay, Richard, why is there something?
Why shouldn't there be something? As you say, if there wasn't, then we wouldn't be here. But the question, why is there something rather than nothing? The origin of the something, the origin of the cosmos, was, I suspect, an extremely simple event. And simple events are very simple to understand and explain. Once upon a time, not that long ago, a couple of centuries ago, the question would not have been, why is there something rather than nothing? The question would have been, why is there all this magnificent life? Why are there trees? Why is there grass? Why are there birds? Why are there humans? Darwin answered that question and blew out of the water the theistic answer to that question. Theists are now driven back to this much, much more simple question: why is there something rather than nothing? Everything else is either explained or well on the way to being explained. We're left with just one little tiny smidgen of a gap in which God is alleged to be hiding. But even if you invoke a supernatural creator to explain why is there something rather than nothing, you've still explained absolutely nothing, because you're left without an explanation for that God himself.
No. See, it doesn't quite work like that. I mean, I can see the point here. If I were to say, what's the explanation of, say, this book, and you said, well, Richard, because he wrote it, right? And then, well, say, what's the explanation of Richard, and say Richard's parents, and so on. Of course, you can keep on going back, right? And no one of these things will do the trick. But the whole point is, you have to answer the question in the following way: either the universe as a whole is self-explanatory, in other words, it contains its explanation in and of itself. And I don't think it does. But no, there can be argument on that, by the way. I mean, so I'm not asserting that dogmatically.
I mean, I've always kind of, when we were having these conversations, I'm sure I've had the same conversation with Richard before. If you go back to the Big Bang, and then you say, well, what was before the Big Bang?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And then if you find some